There were several maids in the palace, some of them at the services of Mena and Meza, the palace princesses. But why do they hate one in particular? What was it about Uto that fueled so much hatred in them? Uto, a young orphaned maid, had been serving in the palace since she was 5 years old. Her father died at war and her mother died at childbirth. Usually, such a baby would have been termed evil because her presence took the lives of her parents, but the priest had something different to say about her destiny. Uto was a different child. She was born with a star on her head. According to the priest, Uto came with a special gift, and as long as she remained in the village, she would bring protection and success to the village and the people in it. Of course, the king was thrilled to hear this. The priest warned the king never to tell anyone about Uto's star. If he did, word might get out, and people from other villages and kingdoms might want to adopt Uto for themselves, because wherever she was bound to bring them safety and success. Keeping a gem like her a secret, even from his wife, the queen, was the best option. The king agreed without hesitation, and he never did. He took the little orphaned baby and raised her up as the palace maid. He didn't want to adopt Uto as his child because he didn't want to raise eyebrows in the village. And also, he wanted his biological children to inherit the throne and not an orphaned child. When she clocked 5 years, she began to serve as a palace maid, running little errands. And shortly after, when the princesses were born, she was made to be their servant. Maids have come and gone in the palace, but for more than 20 years, Uto remained. Mena and Meza hated Uto. And no, it wasn't her beauty that made them despise her. It was the fact that the king had a soft spot for her. No matter what, he didn't want to let Uto go. When they questioned him, he merely said that it wasn't fair to let her live on her own since she didn't have anyone else. Princess Meza and Mena began to develop plans to make her life a living hell. Maybe if we frustrate her enough, she would resign on her own, they said to each other. One time, they called Uto and asked her to go to the nearest village to get them something that could be found in their village market. Uto tried to plead with them to be considerate, but Mena and Meza wouldn't listen to her. They were sending her on this errand when the sun had already gone down, knowing that going to the nearest village usually took hours. Also, it wasn't advisable for women and young girls to ply the road at night because of unforeseen circumstances. Everyone knew this, and that was why Uto pleaded with them to be considerate. Uto told them that she would leave for the market first thing tomorrow morning, since they didn't want her to buy it from their village market. But all her pleas fell on deaf ears. "Are you trying to disobey us?" they asked Uto. Princess Mena and Meza didn't even acknowledge the fact that Uto was older than the both of them. They spoke to her with spite and disrespect. But still, Uto never argued with them. She did everything they asked of her without complaining. Only that this time around, they were asking her to do something that would endanger her life. "Please, I beg of you to be merciful," Uto pleaded, but to no avail. After pleading with them, but they blatantly refused, Uto had no choice but to leave their presence. However, she couldn't risk her life. She might be a maid without parents or a family, but that didn't mean that she was willing to put herself in harm's way. Uto knew that the princesses didn't care for her life, and so, instead of just going on the errand or not going at all, she went to the king and fell on her knees. The king was confused as to why Uto was kneeling before him. Uto told the king that she had been sent on an errand that she couldn't refuse. It was her responsibility to serve the princesses, which she was willing to do, but the errand that they wanted her to run for them would put her life in danger. All Uto was requesting was that the king should plead on her behalf to the princesses to let her get what they wanted at the break of dawn the next day. Besides, it wasn't as though they needed it right away, and even if they did, she could hurry to their village market, which was just a few minutes away from the palace, to get it. Also, walking around the village at night wasn't as dangerous as traveling to another village entirely. When the king heard everything, he was enraged. He summoned Mena and Meza immediately, and he scolded them right in front of Uto. Why would they do something like that? Even though Uto was their maid, she wasn't meant to be treated like an object. The errand was something only the palace guards and village warriors could go for, not someone like Uto. After scolding them, he warned them never to repeat such again. The next time he would hear that they tried something like that, he would make sure they were punished for it. This made the princesses more enraged. Their hatred towards Uto doubled, and as they returned to their room, they realized their mistake. They shouldn't have sent Uto on that errand when the king was in the palace. They should have done that on one of the days the king went on a far trip. Please like and subscribe to this channel for more interesting stories. The king's warning did not stop the princesses from plotting against Uto. If at all, it made them hate Uto even more and desperate to get rid of her. To them, Uto had embarrassed them by going to the king. It was even worse because the king scolded them in front of Uto. Mena and Meza knew that if they had done this to another maid, their father wouldn't have reacted that way. But being that it was Uto, he stood up for her at the detriment of their own happiness. Who is she? And why does he love her so much? Why does he fight for her to stay here? Mena asked. We need to find a way to get her out of here, or she will continue to steal our father's heart and love. Meza said, and so they thought more deeply of something that they could do. They couldn't wait for the king to go on another long trip because they had no idea when that would happen. And they were desperate. They came up with a plan that they were certain would work. Mena and Meza, born into royalty, were given a special and rare bangle. The bangle was made by the priest and it was very, very sacred. No one was supposed to have possession of it because it belonged to royalty. It was one of the most prized possessions of the princesses. Mena and Meza took their royal bangles and went to Uto's hut when she was having her bath, and then they hid it between her belongings and left. Hours later, they raised their voices and cried out, saying that they couldn't find their royal bangles. The king was livid when he heard that the princesses were looking for their royal bangles. He knew that they weren't careless with it. It wasn't even something that they wore all the time, only on special occasions, which went to show how special and sacred it was. Obviously, they had been robbed. Everyone in the village knew that anyone who stole something that belonged to the royal family would have to face the penalty for it, which was either death or banishment. There were no two ways about it. Without delay, the king sent for the village warriors because they were the right persons to handle the search. Every maid and palace guard was a suspect, and in the blink of an eye, the village warriors came. They went into the huts of the palace guards and searched fervently, but they couldn't find the bangles. Then, when they got to the huts of the maids, they found the royal bangles in Uto's possession. By then, news had spread fast all around the village that the princesses had been robbed, and the villagers had left everything they were doing to come to the palace and watch the whole thing unfold. They had been waiting in anticipation for who would be caught. Unfortunately, it turned out to be Uto. I didn't steal their royal bangles, Uche pleaded in tears when she was dragged out. She told the king and everyone else that she had been in the palace from the very first day that she was born, and she started serving when she was 5 years old. All these years, she had never stolen anything, so why should she do so now? She turned to the king and pleaded with everything in her. The king seemed disappointed and upset, and the princesses were certain that he would have to banish Uto forever. That way, they would never have to tolerate her disdainful presence. But the king took everyone by surprise. He told them that he believed that Uto was innocent. Aside from the priest and the midwife who delivered Uto, he was the first person to carry Uto in his arms. She wasn't a thief. The king might not be able to explain how the royal bangles found their way into Uto's belongings, but he was certain that she didn't steal them. The villagers weren't pleased. The king was supposed to pass judgment on Uto and not act in her favor, especially as he couldn't prove that she was innocent, but the king stood his ground. As a king, he had the license to a favorable judgment at least once, and he chose to use it on Uto, which meant that he would never be able to use it ever again. The king knew this, but he didn't mind. So, he asked everyone to return to their homes and forgave Uto right in front of everybody. Princess Mena and Meza were enraged. Their anger knew no bounds. So, their father was willing to use his one-time favor on a common maid simply because he didn't want to banish her. For the first time, the queen was worried about the king's softness for Uto. It wasn't ordinary. It was expected that he would have passed judgment without delay, but he didn't. The moment it was Uto, he became soft. In the privacy of their chamber, the queen asked the king the true story about Uto. With deep concern, she dared to ask him if Uto was his illegitimate child, but the king said that she wasn't. She's merely an orphan who has no one else but this palace, he responded in his usual fashion. He just couldn't tell the queen. his wife, the real truth. When he was done having a conversation with the queen, he called Mena and Meza to speak with them privately. I don't care how the bangles got to Uto's belongings, but instead of raising your voice and alerting everyone, you should have come to me quietly, and we would have resolved this without anyone knowing, the king told Mena and Meza angrily. He wasn't pleased that he had to use his one-time favor. It was always preserved for that special time when it would be highly needed. After that, he asked Mena and Meza to leave his private chamber. Please like and drop a comment for more interesting and entertaining stories. The more the king warned Meza and Mena about Uto, the deeper their hatred went for Uto. It didn't make them stop thinking of ways to get rid of Uto. The last incident made them wiser on the next step to take. Now they knew what they should do and shouldn't do. The princesses wouldn't want to get on the king's nerves again, so that he wouldn't scold them that way. So they decided that the next plan would go perfectly well. It definitely had to. Mena and Meza spent weeks thinking about the perfect plan. Every passing day was a reminder of how much they hated Uto and wanted her out of the palace forever. Again, they came up with the perfect plan. The thing with desperation and hatred was that it could drive any person to any length, and that included Princess Mena and Meza. On a good day, they took a stroll out of the palace without the palace guards. No one was worried because they knew that no harm would come to them. On the contrary, everyone respected and loved the royal family. But Mena and Meza had a different reason why they chose to leave the palace alone. They went far into the bush and waited by the river bank. It was risky and dangerous, but they were willing to pay the price. After waiting for some time, some hunters appeared to have their bath. Everyone in the village knew that hunters from different villages came to that river in the bush to have their bath. Even farmers from other villages and travelers as well. The hunters, although strangers, knew immediately that they were princesses because of how they appeared, and they greeted them with royal respect. But Mena and Meza had something else in mind. Without wasting time, they told the hunters that they had been waiting for them and that they needed them to get a job done. Then the hunters came closer to them, and Mena and Meza talked to them in hushed tones, just in case anyone was nearby. By the time they were done having the conversation, both hunters and the princesses parted ways, smiling. A plan was already in place, and the hunters couldn't wait to execute it and get the money promised by the princesses. Some days later, Mena and Meza called Utu and instructed her to escort them around the village. It came as a surprise because everyone knew that they couldn't stand Utu. Because of the hatred they had for her, they would rather take another maid than Utu, who was their serving maid. Utu had no choice but to go with them. They left the palace a few minutes later. When they began to go far into the bush, Utu became worried and confused. What were the princesses doing in this part of the village? Not that it was forbidden, but they were royalty and shouldn't be found in the bushes for any reason. Anyway, regardless of how worried and confused Utu was, she couldn't ask them any questions. She wouldn't dare. The hunters were already waiting as planned, and Mena and Meza could not wait. As soon as they got to the river bank in the thick bush, Uto couldn't keep it to herself any longer. "What are we doing here?" she asked the princesses. Almost immediately, the hunters came out from their hiding places. Uto thought that they wanted to harm or steal from the princesses, and she swung into action immediately by going to stand in front of them protectively. She was a woman without a weapon and definitely couldn't overpower the hunters, but Uto was ready to give up her life in trying to save the princesses. Mena and Meza burst into laughter, much to Uto's confusion. What was funny? While she was worried that they were about to be attacked, they were laughing. Uto didn't get the chance to ask what was happening. The hunters surrounded her and tied her eyes tightly, preventing her from seeing anything. She tried to break free, but it was futile. She couldn't see the princesses, but she could hear their mocking laughter. It dawned on Uto that they had set her up. She began to plead with them to let her go, and then she promised right there and then that since they really wanted to get rid of her, she would leave on her own because Uto thought that they were going to kill her, and she didn't want to die. Unfortunately, tried as hard as she begged, Princess Mena and Meza refused to change their mind. They told Uto that if they freed her, she would run to the king again and make a report. Uto tried to tell them that she wouldn't, but they didn't pay attention to her. Mena and Meza paid the hunters in full, and then they turned around and returned to the palace. The hunters blindfolded Uto and took her far away from the village. They took her through bushes and forests. Uto pleaded all through the journey, but they didn't leave her be. She feared that they were paid to kill her by the princesses, but she was wrong. When they got to a small village, they left Uto there and went their way. According to the agreement, they were never to come back to that river again since they had the money, so they took a different turn. A while later, the villagers saw Uto, untied her eyes, and took her to their king. When Uto got to the palace, she told them everything that had happened to her. The king and all his villagers felt pity for her. Immediately, the king not only asked Uto to remain in their village, he also gave her a royal room in the palace and adopted her as one of his own. The best part of it was that the queen, along with the only prince and princess, welcomed Uto with warm arms. Finally, Uto had found a home. Subscribe to this channel for more interesting and amazing stories. The king didn't notice Uto's absence until the next day, and so he asked about her, but the palace guards told him that they hadn't seen Uto since she escorted the princesses out of the palace the day before. The king became worried. He summoned Mena and Meza to his chamber and asked them where Uto was. The princesses burst into tears immediately, wailing as though they were mourning someone. The king urged them to speak, and they told the king that while they were out yesterday, they came across a wild animal. They all ran, but Uto wasn't fast enough. The wild animal caught Uto and tore her into shreds. The king was shocked as he began to breathe really hard. He asked the princesses why they didn't say anything to him since they got back yesterday, and they told the king that they were very much shaken by what happened. He also asked them why they had gone into the bush, and they simply said that they had wanted to explore, saying that they hadn't gone to that part of the village before. "You should have gone with the guards and not Uto," the king barked. He sent the palace guards immediately into the bush, but they came back with news that they didn't see any trace of Uto. Maybe the wild animal ate her up completely and left no crumbs. Mena and Meza were very excited. Finally, their plan had worked. The king wasn't even suspecting that they must have planned it, and no one was blaming them. But they became slightly worried when the king tore his clothes, fell on his knees, and wept regretfully. Soon enough, everyone gathered around the king, wondering why he was acting that way about a common maid. It wasn't usual. Gossip always spread like wildfire, and so in no time, the villagers had heard that Uto was dead, and the king was crying like a baby in his chamber. Of course, they all ran to the palace to see what was going on. That was when the king revealed to everyone why he protected Uto with everything he had and never let her go. He told them everything the priest, who was already dead by the way, told him about Uto, and how she had been the one saving them from external attacks and the reason for all their bountiful successes. The villagers were shocked. It dawned on everyone that since Uto was born, they had never suffered war or oppression from more powerful villages, and everyone excelled in whatever they laid their hands to do: hunting, farming, wood chopping, and even weaving. No one suffered loss or evil attack. It was all Uto. Princess Mena and Meza were shocked at this revelation, and instantly they became regretful of their actions. If they had known, they would not have done what they did. And when they saw how much it affected their father, the king, and the entire village, they knew they had to confess. The king's face fell into his palms in regret. Why did they do this to him and the entire village? They had taken Uto's star to another village because wherever she was, that village was bound to excel, especially if they accepted her. The villagers were willing to go and bring Uto back, but unfortunately, the princess didn't know the hunters they paid to take Uto away. It was even worse because they asked them never to return to the riverbank or even hunt anywhere close to the village forest. Also, they had no idea the village they took Uto to because they didn't even care to ask. The villagers broke down in tears, but that was just the beginning of bad things to come for all of them. Their covering had been taken away from them. That same month, most of the villagers lost their goods. The crops in the farms began to rot away, while most of them didn't even produce anything. Hunters couldn't get a single animal on their traps. The market became dry, children started to fall sick, and the fresh leaves on the trees began to dry up. No matter how hard the villagers worked, they always faced challenges. The last straw was when they got a message that a more powerful village was coming to terrorize and dominate them. The villagers, enraged and frustrated, marched to the palace. It was one thing to face all sorts of challenges and bad luck, but being terrorized and ruled over on top of that was something that no village should ever have to experience. The king was clueless. He didn't know what to do. Their warriors were a no match for the powerful village. So, it was pointless trying to resist. At the end of the day, there was only one thing to be done, which was to give out the princesses, Mena and Meza, to the powerful village as their maids, just to appease them and keep them from coming. When Mena and Meza heard about it, they fell on their knees and begged in tears, but the villagers wouldn't change their minds. Besides, they were the reason Uto wasn't with them any longer. They couldn't sacrifice the safety of the entire village just for the sake of two princesses. Mena and Meza begged their father, the king, but he couldn't do anything because he already used his one-time favor on Uto. All thanks to them. The king, in pain, gave up the princesses and turned his back on them. The villagers took Mena and Meza and offered them to the powerful village who accepted them, causing them to change their minds on dominating their village. The princesses, who had everything they ever needed, had now gone from royalty to being common palace maids. Hmm. As for Uto, she was very happy in her new village because she was not just accepted, but she was also married off to the caring and handsome prince, which meant that Uto was the next queen of the village. Are you yet to subscribe to this channel? Please do to get more interesting and entertaining stories.